Okay, welcome everyone to this second emergency webinar that we've had on the Russian-Ukraine situation. I'm joined once again with Dr. Samuel Ramani, who we had last week. Sam is an associate fellow of RUSI, which is one of the oldest defense think tanks in the world. As well as that, he's a tutor at Oxford, and he's a real Russia expert, having written many books on the subject, with one coming out soon on Russia and Africa. We were lucky to have Sam last week. Obviously, a lot has changed. We had the webinar a day before the invasion, but obviously a lot has changed since then. And over the course of the weekend, we've had sanctions. We've had more incursions by the Russians in Ukraine. So we'll get an update on all of this. We'll also be joined later on in this webinar with Tim Ash, who's a portfolio manager who has a lot of experience trading Ukraine and Russia. He unfortunately has been delayed somewhat because Ukraine's Ministry of Finance is having a call right now, and he's on the phone with them. So hopefully, once he's off the call with them, he'll be able to join us as well. Before we start, I just wanted to flag a few things on the macro Hive side, just so that people know how they can get some support from our side during this period. Some of the things we've been doing, let me just share my screen here. Obviously in times like this, it's one of the things we try to do our best with is use our experience and our network to try to get a very sort of unbiased and objective view of what's going on the ground. So, for example, today we published something on Russia, Ukraine, 6 things you need to know, where we kind of looked at things objectively as possible around that. So keep coming to the site to get those updates. If you remember, you'll be able to get access to that very easily. On top of that, we've also released some of our work that we've been doing in the background earlier than we were expecting. So, for example, we've been working on a recession model, a model that uses the US yield curve to give you a probability of recession in the US. So we're going to release that early. It'll be coming onto the Macro Hive site tomorrow. So at the moment, the model over the past 4 or 5 weeks has gone up to now giving you a probability that the US will hit recession of around 35 to 40% in the next 12 months. So we're kind of trying to sort of give you more tools that you can use in times like this. And then finally, many of you who follow our crypto work will know that we have built these crypto indices, which cover different themes. So we have a crypto index that covers the DeFi coins, the metaverse coins, smart contract coins. We're going to launch a new index which covers privacy coins. So these are coins that are hard to trace. And obviously, with what's going on in Russia, the talk about Russia potentially adopting cryptocurrencies, and many people getting concerned about how they can move money around without being sanctioned. So we're going to have a new index to see how do privacy coins, how are they performing in this current environment. So keep an eye out for that as well. But back to the topic at hand. Perhaps, Sam, let's just kind of start with some context here. Obviously, we've had this invasion. It's a surprise how extreme the invasion has been. At the same time, the response by the West has also been quite dramatic as well, with sanctions, ejection from SWIFT, sanctions on the central bank, and so on. So why don't you give us kind of your take of where we are at the moment? I think you're on mute, the classic Zoom thing here. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So where we are at the moment, I mean, I think it's really hard to exactly say how this is all going to play out. It certainly appears as if Russia has managed to launch a multi-pronged attack on Ukraine. It's via Belarus to attack Kiev, escalations in the east that are now pushing on Mariupol and Odessa, which are two major population centers and logistical points.
I'm just bringing up a map, by the way. This is the BBC map of the invasion.
Yes.
So you're saying, yeah. So these are all the red
zones. And there's also a continued push from the Russian side to kind of try to take over Kharkiv. There are mixed reports as to how successful the military operations have been. It appears as if Mariupol is under siege, but it hasn't fallen. It's important to keep in mind that Mariupol back in the 2014-2015 campaign was something of a Panjshir Valley of Ukraine, effectively an enclave that was very, very difficult for the Russians to take over simply because of the level of pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian sentiments in that area. Kharkiv has appeared to have withstood extensive bombardment from Russia. Kiev is reportedly encircled. though Zelenskyy has denied that. And Odessa is currently facing a multi-pronged assault. So it's clear that what we're seeing is a movement on multiple fronts from the military side. How successful have the Russian military operations have been? It appears as if Russia's blitz and their entry into major cities and major population centers and their attacks on multiple fronts at once, which are enabled by Belarus, crucially, logistically, and now perhaps militarily with the introduction of forces and jets in the near future, was very successful. The actual military operations themselves have proven to be much less successful. There's been numerous credible reports of Russian soldiers and Russian personnel simply either defecting from their brigades or running out of supplies or having fundamental and basic problems trying to attack the Ukrainian counterparts. And there is a strong Ukrainian resistance, including the strength of the Ukrainian Air Force, which many people did not necessarily take into account. In terms of casualty numbers, on the first day of the campaign, we're looking at 450, according to the British estimates. Ukrainian estimates run much higher, to in excess of 3,500 or 4,000 throughout the entire conflict, as well as the loss of sizable amounts of military equipment. So it's clear that what Russia's in is that they've managed to launch a successful offensive in a multi-pronged way, but a fast capture of Kiev and a fast movement is unlikely to occur at this time.
Sam, just to kind of interject there. I mean, we've gone from 0 to 100 just like that in the space of a few days. I mean, what do you think is the calculation here for such a dramatic invasion? I mean, this is a full-on invasion, and they're encircling Kiev, for example, and as you said, and attacking from multiple fronts.
Well, I think that the ambition coming from the Russian side was certainly to carry out a regime change in Ukraine. That was abundantly clear from the speeches that were delivered first by Vladimir Putin at 5:45 a.m. on the day of the invasion, where he basically declared it as an effort to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Denazification refers to the longstanding conspiracy theory within the Kremlin that the Euromaidan revolution of 2014 was not an actual organic protest movement, but was in fact a neo-Nazi coup and backed by Western powers. And also the demilitarization of Ukraine refers to basically ensuring that Ukraine does not supposedly act as a bulwark for a Western attack on Russia, as they see it, and also to enshrine and ensure Ukraine's not only neutrality at this point, but also subordination in the security sphere towards Russia. So it appears as if the end goal is to remove Volodymyr Zelenskyy and replace him with a much more pliable alternative. And that pliable alternative is most likely to be Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a close ally and associate of Vladimir Putin. Putin is the godfather to his daughter. And it's very interesting that within the past 24 hours, Medvedchuk has actually escaped house arrest in Kiev. He was detained by the Ukrainian authorities earlier in January amidst concerns about his pro-Russian sentiments, as well as some legal complications. It will either be him or one of his close associates, like Olesaryov and Yevhen Murayev, both former MPs, have been rumored to be the two that could come. That's what seems to be the goal and why this is so expansive. Because if it was just about making a signal back home, all that would have been necessary probably would have been just to take Donbass in the east.
And one thing, at least in kind of if you watch TV in the West, which obviously it'll kind of we probably don't get things fully sort of unfiltered, is Zelenskyy seems to be turning into a bit of a hero, and you know, so his sort of standing has probably increased quite dramatically during this period. So does that mean it's harder to dislodge him?
Well, I mean, Zelenskyy is going to be extremely popular now after this conflict. He's been seen as a very effective wartime president who not only in the days leading up to the invasion tried to establish an atmosphere of cool-headedness and calm, but when the invasion came, quite unexpectedly, he seems to have been striking the right balance between active diplomatic negotiations and leadership in the military sphere. So he's been widely praised even by people who were initially quite skeptical of him, given the fact that he lacked political experience, given the fact that he was just an actor and a comedian before taking power, right? So that's been good for him. It was also due to the fact that there had been numerous problems, like a slowing of his anti-corruption campaign. There were some questions about his advancement of figures like Yurchak, who were like kind of seemed to be too close towards Russia. Concerns about the fact that, you know, he hadn't managed the situations with the Russians that well since the hostage negotiations of 2019, the COVID pandemic, socioeconomic problems. Zelensky's approval ratings and popularity has slid below Petro Poroshenko. who was removed in a landslide in the last elections in 2019. He barely got a quarter of the vote. Zelenskyy got 73%, and then Poroshenko was more popular. So now that's totally changed. I mean, Zelenskyy is now is going to be a very formidable political force if Ukraine does survive as a country, does survive in power, and in the conflict setting, that's going to lead to loyalty between not just Ukrainian speakers, but also Russian language speakers within the population. And that's been a cardinal goal of his presidency. Has been to bridge some of those traditional linguistic and regional divides ever since 2019.
And have you been surprised by the Western response in terms of the sanctions, SWIFT, the central bank, and so on?
Yeah, well, the Western response seemed very inchoate, right, before the actual invasion took place. There were numerous countries like Bulgaria, Denmark, Romania, which were actually calling for preemptive sanctions against Russia. They were calling for sanctions to on Russia just for its mobilization, Ukraine for its cyber attacks, and for its other threats to European security. And they were also calls for sanctions after the immediate recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk. And in those days that followed, there was a lot of chaos within particularly the European side, as to what to do. I mean, it appeared as if there were going to be actors like Germany, Italy, Hungary, Cyprus, which were not going to go along with something as expansive as kicking Russia out of SWIFT. There were a lot of uncertainties about, for example, a willingness to kind of cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There were concerns whether Britain would actually crack down on some of the oligarch and dirty money that's been floating around and really crack down on that, especially in London, and whether other European capitals would follow suit. So there was a lot of reasons to believe that there would be a lot of divisions just in terms of sanctions, and also divisions in the military sphere. Certainly Germany, it's so categorically ruled out selling any kinds of lethal arms towards Ukraine, or even authorizing their transfer from a third country like the Netherlands, like we saw happen over the weekend. And Sweden and Finland sending arms, Switzerland breaking its neutrality and sanctioning Russia like it did in 2014. None of these things were really expected developments. So the degree to which the West has responded with an unprecedented degree of unity, that has sealed all those divides off, and also ensured that countries that were traditionally, or at least in the past month, been on the fence about punishing Russia at all, like Hungary, are now talking about European unity and towing the European line to some degree on migration with regards to Ukrainians. Croatia, which wanted to kick NATO forces, not participate in any kind of NATO mission with regards to Ukraine, stridently condemning the invasion. Even Czech President Miloš Zeman condemning Russia. Bulgaria firing its defense minister for being too close to Russia. This kind of unity is something that's really heartening from a pro-Ukrainian perspective, as well as a sign that the transatlantic alliance is more robust than we had feared.
And what did you make of the Olaf Scholz speech, sort of the turning point speech that happened over the weekend? It seemed, I mean, for me, reading it seemed like quite a striking speech in terms of they're going to ramp up defense spending, they're going to review their energy independence or their reliance on energy suppliers. It did seem like quite a big turnaround from what we've seen before.
Well, definitely, yeah, it's a massive turnaround from Olaf Scholz. I mean, obviously, and from Germany in general. Okay, I think I'm frozen.
Oops.
Yeah, it's a massive. Yeah, okay, so let's go back. Yeah, it's a massive turnaround from Olaf Scholz and from Germany in general. The last time the German defense spending had actually crossed the 2% parameter was in the last year of the Cold War, 1991. So when it hit 2.03%. And now with 100 billion euros in new spending, it's going to likely go back to the levels that we haven't really seen since the 1980s. So this is a major and drastic overhaul in German defense policy, especially given the fact that Trump, during his presidency, had pushed and lobbied Germany to increase defense spending to the 2% target, and he was so flatly rebuffed. And now it's happening again, will also spark a mixture of reactions, I'm sure, in the United States. With regards to the dependence on energy, absolutely. The building of 2 new LNG import terminals is quite significant to reduce dependency on Russian gas. It's obviously unclear whether there's going to be a dramatic shift towards revival of nuclear power plants, because the Green Party has put so much effort into phasing those out. But it's clear that there is going to be a more significant movement, and we should watch for there's even one statement that came from the Germans after this, saying that there'll be no taboos with regards to energy, which might even lead to coal and nuclear lasting for a lot longer than some might expect. And we should also watch for Germany very actively following the cues that were set by Italy today. Italy, Luigi Di Maio has now talking to Algeria about increasing emergency gas supplies to replace Russian gas. And I expect that Germany is going to be just as proactive in pushing out to alternative suppliers to complement these moves too.
And do you have a view on the Chinese position? They've had some statements. They had the UN thing at the end of last week. How are you taking sort of China's position on Russia?
Well, China's position on this is very interesting to follow. The actual statements that we've seen in 2022 and 2014 are very, very similar in nature. They both are restrained. They're cautious. They don't condemn necessarily the Russian invasion, but they also express some degree of support for Ukrainian territorial integrity, which suggests that they're not going fully along with Russia's objectives over here. China, of course, did not recognize the annexation of Crimea and views Crimea still as being part of Ukraine. It has predictably not gone along and recognized Donetsk or Luhansk as independent states. It views them as part of Ukraine as well. So that's important to keep in mind, that China is not condemning Russia, but also not necessarily agreeing with Russia. And the fact that China did not veto the resolution in the UN Security Council that was criticizing Russia, even though it's often sided with Russia and blocking reports in the past. Like, for example, when the UN was looking into human rights abuses from the Wagner Group and private contractors, China flat out prevented that report from being published. So China has no qualms about joining Russia or using its veto pen to defend Russia if it wants to. But the fact that it abstained, along with India and the United Arab Emirates, suggests precisely this, that it's acknowledging that the Russian aggression is potentially problematic to some degree. It's not recognizing the Russian seizure of territory, but equally, it doesn't want to rock the boat and condemn Russia. And but also, I think that in the long run, this is going to lead to a lot stronger relations between Russia and China, even if China is not returning what Russia has offered them. So Russia recognizes Taiwan and Hong Kong. China's not doing that. There's still going to be closer relationships due to a variety of reasons. And number one, the Chinese state-aligned media and Chinese foreign ministry spokesman Li Jianjiao even today have strongly been promoting Russian narratives about this conflict, which frame the United States as an aggressor, which are criticizing the U.S. And Europeans for bringing in lethal arms, and even showing like that chart that Li Jianjiao just shared today about all the U.S. invasions and bombings of other countries are playing right into Russian whataboutisms. So as Russian state media and as Russian sources of information like RT and Sputnik get banned from Europe and get thrown off the airwaves in the Western world, China is actually doing Russia's bidding in the information sphere in terms of promoting a lot of their narratives and amplifying the shaking of the digital footprint from Russia. So that's an important component where they're working together. On the economic side of things, the Chinese and the Russians are working a lot more closely together, with China allowing for the import of Russian wheat and China continuing to allow Russian gas to pump at unprecedented levels. And that's likely to continue growing with the deals that were signed at the Beijing Olympics. There are a couple of risk factors and things to look forward to. It appears as if a couple of Chinese banks, including the Bank of China and ICBC, are a little bit concerned about the impact of secondary sanctions on Russia for some of their transactions of a commodity financing. There were even reports over the weekend that they were starting to scale back on the amount of financing that they're giving in the short term. That could likely be just a cosmetic shift that's due to their unwillingness to do transactions in US dollars, leading to more of a rebalance towards the use of the renminbi yuan. But it's abundantly clear that the Chinese will be watching secondary sanctions closely on Russia, just like the way they have on Iran in the past. So they'll be trying to thread the needle to make sure that their major entities don't get slammed. And the second is a concern from the Russian side, where even Russian nationalists and Kremlin conservatives, when you look at the Russian media, who are supportive of the war and have been supportive of Putin's foreign policy objectives from the beginning, are now alarmed by the degree of dependence on China. There's talk about Russia being a junior partner to China now, much more vividly than ever before, and what that might mean in terms of even vassalization of Russia to China. And that could lead to some frictions within Putin's foreign policy establishment down the road. So that's kind of how I see it going forward from that point of view.
And you mentioned that Switzerland has joined the EU in terms of implementing the sanctions against Russia. In terms of the other kind of financial centers and kind of large economies, we talk about China, sort of remains kind of tied to Russia or allied to Russia in some forms. India and UAE, what are their positions?
So the Indian position is very similar to the Chinese position in a lot of ways. in that they're acknowledging that Russia does have a legitimate security interest in order to attack Ukraine, but again, stopping short of recognizing Russia's annexation of territory or outrightly defending Russia in the United Nations, again, going for the position of an abstention. And that is, again, a carryover to what Modi had said in 2014. Indians are a little less vocal than the Chinese about full-heartedly embracing Russian narratives. Like, in 2014, the Chinese talked about violent extremism as a code for fascism and the junta. Now they're talking about NATO expansion in a dark and sinister way. The Indians are not engaging in the hyperbole, but they're basically engaging in the same kind of policy. And also rupee to ruble trade transfers and monetary transfers are worth watching too, because India needs Russian fertilizer for its agriculture. So there's a lot of interest at play there. With respect to the UAE, that's a very interesting one. And Dubai is going to be inevitably emerging as a much more important financial center for Russian money and Russian assets now that European capitals have closed down. And there's a lot of Russian officials at a very high level who have a lot of deep relations and connections inside the UAE, including Nikolai Patrushev, who is a key figure in the national security establishment in Russia, who's got a close friendship with Sheikh Tahnoun, the national security advisor in the UAE, and is a regular visitor there. You see other figures, including Sergei Lavrov and Abdullah bin Zayed, now maintaining contact in this crisis and even holding talks over today about not just condemnation, but also looking ahead at cooperation between Russia and the UAE and taking the partnership forward. And the Emiratis were striking in the UNSC by releasing a very brief statement about the war that neither condemned or really made a clear statement, and also abstaining. So I think that the Emirati position as a financial center for Russia remains significant. They're not going to condemn it anytime soon. And that's the line that's being shared elsewhere in the Gulf as well. I mean, the Saudis and the Qataris have been pretty cautious too. So the Qataris have been a little more on the pro-Ukrainian side because Volodymyr Zelenskyy called the Qatari emir in the hours after the invasion. I'm sure they talked about gas supply. So they're a little more nuanced, but the Emiratis are going to probably de facto toe the Russian line just by not criticizing it.
Okay, so there are some kind of economic outlets and financial outlets for Russia with all of these countries that you've mentioned.
Certainly, yeah. There's some outlets. I mean, I don't think that that obviously Hong Kong. There's obviously Dubai. I mean, Taiwan is not because they're sanctioning on semiconductors. Japan is not. They're joining the sanctions. But there are still some others, yes.
Yeah. And what are you surprised by the scale of the sanctions that the EU and the US have imposed?
Scale of sanctions, yes. Not because these sanctions had not been discussed. I mean, we discussed all these things before. We discussed SWIFT. We discussed personally sanctioning Putin. We discussed targeting oligarch assets. But this was like the maximalist scenario that's actually played out. So there's nothing really new that's entered the discourse or the policy world in terms of actual sanctions being implemented. But I'm very surprised by the degree to which European countries were able to put their differences aside and unite around this threat, as I said earlier.
Yeah, I mean, we have a question from one of our listeners who, and other attendees, feel free to post your questions. Lorenzo's asking. He listened to your last webinar with us, and he's saying that it seems we're already beyond the all-in strategy by the EU that you referred to last time. Do you agree? And also, do you still consider that the most potentially dangerous approach in terms of getting a kind of a irrational reaction by Putin?
Well, the situation has changed quite substantially since then. When I was thinking about an all-in approach being dangerous, I was concerned about cornering Vladimir Putin into doing something much larger. So I was envisioning a scenario, which was actually the scenario that was very widely viewed by many in the Russian studies community, that Russia would use of force in Donbass, dangle its 200,000 troops around neighboring countries, threaten to kind of go rogue or go insane, if you will, without actually going insane by carrying out these interventions of the scale. But now he has engaged in something much larger. So there was really no choice from the European side to condemn this invasion in the strongest possible terms in the United States and also impose the most stringent sanctions possible on Russia as a deterrent. Though I don't think these sanctions are necessarily going to deter Russia's course, nor are they necessarily going to lead to irrational behavior that would not have happened otherwise. There were already things in the works with regards to Belarus hosting nuclear weapons and having that referendum even before these sanctions were imposed. And that could happen. The nuclear flexing that we saw happen over the weekend where Vladimir Putin put the nukes on alert is nothing new. And that's the kind of thing that we've seen happened before.
So when you say nothing new, so your interpretation of that statement is not necessarily that's moving to red alert. That's just a reiteration of what's always happens.
I wouldn't say it would not always
not
happen.
always
but
happens, but
it's not. The point is, it's not really unprecedented for Russia to make that kind of discourse as part of what it's doing, because even if it was a little more extreme than past statements, when Russia tests new nuclear technology and Russia tests new hypersonic missiles, what does it do? It does huge billboards, which basically show these nukes and these targets hitting Florida, right? So this kind of hyperbole and this kind of like a threatening rhetoric and bellicose rhetoric and reminders that Russia's got a nuclear button and they can attack anyone at any time is not entirely new. So I don't think that it was necessarily. I mean, the sanctions may have been convenient timing for this to happen, but this kind of saber rattling would have happened even with the transfers of arms to Ukraine, like we've said.
Okay, yeah.
Because Russia made it very clear that if you aid Ukraine in any way, particularly militarily, or get involved in this conflict, you'll see consequences like you've never seen before. So that statement was a precursor to this, right?
Yeah. And there's another question here, and it says, it feels like in just about any outcome, Putin has miscalculated. And even if this ends up, even if he ends up attaining his objectives, Russia and Putin are long-term losers. What's a reasonable off-ramp that the West can offer Putin to end this?
I think that's absolutely a question. I mean, I think that certainly that this has not worked out according to plan. And there's going to be a lot of recriminations internally within Russia. We've seen those reports about Valery Gerasimov eventually getting dismissed, but then we saw him yesterday at the meeting and he looked like he was there with the nuclear meeting. And so there's going to be wholesale personnel shifts internally. There's going to be a lot of introspection. There's going to be a lot of instability, I think, even within the Russian inner circle going forward. And if we see those moves and those kind of things being made, that would be the clearest acknowledgement possible that the war is not going well and Vladimir Putin might be down to potentially have some kind of a reconsideration. So we should watch as a litmus test for whether Russia is willing to sue for peace or have dialogue. Look for major internal personnel shifts within the military and the security establishment, which, if the Gerasimov report had any credibility this weekend, could be on the immediate horizon. Right now, I just don't think that Putin is in a position where he's really that interested in entertaining peace talks. Who is he, for example, bringing to the peace talks with Ukraine that are being held on the Belarusian border? He's bringing Vladimir Medvinsky. Vladimir Medvinsky was a figure who, during the first annexation of Crimea, was one of the leading originators of the Donbass genocide conspiracy. He urged for a strong military to kind of fight Ukrainian aggression. He called for the creation of a patriotic internet to purge Western values out of Russia, and claimed that Russia stands for the truth and the West stands for lies repeatedly, countless times. I mean, he's bringing an ideological extremist to these peace talks that who supports this kind of revanchism full-heartedly. So that's not something that the Ukrainians are going to view as acceptable. So right now, I'm not thinking that Russia is very serious about peace or diplomacy. Russia's calls for demilitarization of Ukraine are obviously completely unacceptable from the Ukrainian point of view because that's tantamount to a surrender. So, and insistence on Belarus as a hosting site when Ukraine said, no, Belarus is a co-aggressor. If you want to take this seriously, move the talks to Turkey, move them to Baku, move them to Budapest, Bratislava, find some other place. Don't put it there. So I don't think that Russia's in a position to negotiate for some of those factors that I've just listed here. But if the war continues to go badly, and we see some of those personnel shifts in the security establishment, which I think are possibly imminent, what we'll see is maybe Russia accepting a withdrawal in exchange for de facto control over parts of Donbass and Ukraine getting a neutrality for an indefinite period of time, like not joining NATO for an indefinite period of time. That's one compromise I can see the Russians going with and accepting. But that would only be if they face a attritional war of resistance in Kiev and days or weeks pass, and it just does not look as if they're going to be able to get that regime change done, and casualties continue to mount at 450 plus a day, like we've seen in the early days.
And we have on the military side, we have a question. Do you think Russia has held back on using heavier arms so far? And could that change in the next few days? And also, can you see Ukraine somehow accepting a Russian supportive regime taking over in Ukraine?
I mean, with regards to Russian military restraint, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I mean, early on, when we first saw the intervention, there were some parallels and commentators that were noting this. And by the way, I recommend two people in particular who you guys must pay attention to on these Russian military developments, who are dead right on the invasion from the beginning. One is Rob Lee, one is Michael Kaufman. And both of them were noticing this early on because the Russians did not seem to be as willing to engage in mass civilian attacks or civilian casualties as they were in Syria, for example, in the initial hours. They were more focused, apparently, on terrain rather than targeting the biggest population centers with full aggression. But now they are coming and making much more assertive moves as the war goes on these major population centers. What we're already starting to see is the movement of major armed convoys towards Kiev over the course of the weekend that we've seen happen. We've seen basically, so it's a much larger focus on taking over that city. We've seen a very similar level of increased aerial bombardment, and including the introduction of Su-34 jets over Kharkiv. Previously, we had seen lower grade Su-25 jets coming over Kharkiv. This is a change that's happened just within the past several hours. So what we're seeing is in both the Kharkiv and the Kiev fronts in particular, a much more extensive use of heavy weaponry, both on the ground and in air. And that suggests that they're really viewing those two cities as effective linchpins of this campaign. If they can't take Kiev and they at least will want to take Novorossiya and Donbass, that makes Kharkiv important. If they are going for outright regime change, they need to take the capital. So that's why they're focusing on those two.
Okay, understood. And, there's a question here from Francesca who's asking, what's a reasonable offer that the Ukrainians would accept? So the Ukrainian side of the equation.
So the Ukrainian side of the equation, it's obviously... Oh, sorry. Yeah, one moment. So the Ukrainian side of the equation, with respect to what's happening here, I would say that the Ukrainians are not necessarily willing to compromise anytime soon in this current climate, because they view basically this, even if the Russians were to pause temporarily, they'll view it as a kind of a salami tactic, as a slow, large-scale annexation that's happening in slower motion. It was abundantly clear that the Minsk agreements and the Minsk Accords were not able to restrain the Russians any time further in 2014 and 2015. That was quite significant because the Minsk Accords categorically ruled out any kind of movement to the line of control, even in areas like Debaltseve or Mariupol, and certainly not the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as anything more than autonomous or independent states. So the Russians had already violated the existing peace agreement, and any new peace agreement will be seen in Ukraine as just like the Budapest Memorandum or the Minsk Accords, and it's not something that would be very desirable at this time. The Ukrainians want to show their strength, they want to show their military resistance, their ability to defend the capital, and they're also cognizant of the fact that these negotiations are occurring under the barrel of a gun. Dmitry Peskov insisted that there was no way, even if peace talks were to escalate or were to improve, that Russia would suspend or consider a ceasefire in its military offensives. And that's a significant move. The Ukrainians would only start even taking these peace talks somewhat seriously on the Russian side if they felt that Kiev was about to fall, or they felt that the situation was much more problematic, or if the Russians at least made some kind of a tentative offer on the ceasefire end.
Okay, understood. There's a few questions on the international community side. So one person's asking, how serious is the EU signal that they may consider inviting Ukraine for membership, and the consequence on the entire Ukraine issue? Yeah, so EU signal that, inviting Ukraine to join the EU.
So that's obviously an interesting step, right? Because Poland basically made a statement earlier last week, basically making a strong hint that the Ukrainians could join the European Union, and it would be done through immediate membership and via special emergency procedure. So not through the usual channels. And that initial statement did not seem to get much coverage or much notability from the EU member states, who were somewhat enthusiastic about the idea of a EU association agreement, especially after Euromaidan. Before that, they were even split on that. And they certainly were not really of the frame of mind to join NATO. So to make Ukraine join the EU. So the same countries that are skeptical of Ukraine joining NATO, including the Germans and the French, were not so inclined about taking Ukraine into the European Union for obvious reasons as well, from everything from concerns about migration to just the fact that the EU alliance may not just be able to withstand or take in effectively what could be a collapsed economy after this war. So there was not much moving from the Polish request to the European Union in the initial days afterward. But Zelenskyy is now pushing the issue. He's calling for immediate membership. He signed an agreement now, actually, that's actually pushing for it. So I think that, it's hard to say whether Ukraine will actually be able to join the EU, but even though it is talking about it quite carefully with the Council of Europe, and the Council of Europe, of course, suspended Russia recently for the first time since 2019. So they're definitely a party that could be open to engaging with it. But I think that it's obvious that if the Russians do have a ceasefire and they don't take over Kiev and there's whatever rump of Ukraine is left, I think that the chances of them being integrated into the Western security architecture are actually higher rather than lower after this conflict.
Yeah. And then the question here from Paul, due to the UK being so relatively outspoken regarding sanctions and support for Ukraine, could it be singled out for some sort of direct strike?
Well, Britain has definitely played a major role in pushing for these sanctions. I mean, Britain obviously was the first country to really lobby aggressively for the Russian removal from SWIFT, for example. Britain did take the lead initially on the sanctioning of oligarch assets before others were considering it, talking about individual sanctions against lawmakers and Vladimir Putin in a more aggressive way, even talking about Vladimir Putin being put towards war crimes. And now Ukraine is filing that case in the International Court of Justice, basically alleging that what the Russians have done is tantamount to a genocide inside Ukraine. So Britain has taken the lead on multiple fronts, as I've noted over here, and it's been quite significant. Geopolitically, it's noteworthy. This is probably one of the most drastic areas of departure between Britain and the European Union, at least in those initial days, on the issue of SWIFT that we've seen in the post-Brexit environment. So it's a sign of Britain's ability to kind of straddle the transatlantic divide in quite an effective way, balance between US and EU objectives, and also act as a point of pressure on the Europeans to comply more closely to what the Americans might want. So it's been very interesting from the British perspective how they managed to pull this off and how they managed to take it on. Will Britain be more aggressively targeted by Russia as a result of this? That is really hard to say. There already was an operating assumption inside Russia that the Russia-UK relationship was in an even worse state than the relationship between Russia and the United States. And that's not new. Even during the spring brinkmanship escalations, when Biden was considering a summit with Putin, you saw Russian officials were saying that a Boris Johnson-Vladimir Putin summit to have any kind of productive conclusions was even less likely. We've seen the Russian media and Russian diplomats effectively troll Boris Johnson over Partygate and many of the personal indiscretions that he's had in very personal and very aggressive terms, not even given towards the U.S. leadership by figures at that level. So there's not really much expectation of Britain doing anything but what it's already done, and the Russians are not surprised by it. But two things to watch out for would obviously be Russia targeting Britain with some degree of cyber attack, or Russia engaging in more and more provocative drills in and around British airspace. So the incident that we saw a couple of days ago on the English Channel as well, where the French seized a Russian sanctioned vessel, is interesting to watch. Will there be more provocative movements in the naval sphere? Will there be Russian drills that violate British airspace? Will we have the kind of drills that Ireland managed to stave off with those fishermen protesting a few weeks back happening in and around the area around Ireland too? So those are probably the most likely forms of retaliation from Russia. And again, that is most likely nothing new except for the cyber attacks, which are an option.
Yeah. So someone's mentioning that there's some tweets going around that Gerasimov's been fired. Right. I mean, have you heard about that, or is that, I guess it's hard to verify with these sorts of things.
It's very hard to verify. Yeah, there was obviously a number of people. I think Alexander Vindman, for example, who was from the Trump impeachment trial. He was one of the more vocal people who's kind of been pushing this idea with a higher degree of confidence than some others. So it's been out there. I don't have any verification that would suggest that it has happened at this moment in time. Gerasimov was at the meeting with Sergei Shoigu yesterday talking about the nuclear deterrent. And he obviously is so inextricably linked to the Russian hybrid war doctrine, the Gerasimov doctrine that really combines disinformation, diplomacy, the use of multiple measures of military attacks, peacekeeping, deterrence that we've seen in Ukraine. He carved the response to the color revolutions, Arab Spring, and Euromaidan. So his removal will be quite a significant sign that the Russian involvement in Ukraine is not going very well. But the question is, what kind of person could replace somebody like Gerasimov? That's something that's important to keep in mind too. Gerasimov, for all of his association with those extreme Russian policies, is also one of the last points of contact between the United States and Russia inside Syria. Even on the issue of Syrian reconstruction funding, it was Gerasimov who made the request to the Americans to ease some of the sanctions around Syria before the Caesar Act was imposed. Sergei
Okay.
Shoigu was, for example, was also, even he may seem very militaristic and be reiterating certain narratives from the Kremlin, like Ukraine has got nukes that are moving at a faster degree than Iran and North Korea's are, but also he served as a diplomat in peace talks. It's possible that if the Gerasimovs and the Shoigus are removed, they will be replaced by people who are much more ideological, much more radical, much more extreme, like a Medvinsky type taking over there. And that's the moment of real danger with regards to a nuclear threat or an attack on a NATO country, because Putin's inner circle will basically be surrounded by this same kind of group thing that's prompted some of the outrageous comments he's made in his speeches over the past few days.
Yeah. Okay. We're getting a couple of questions about the domestic situation in Russia.
Right.
So one's on bank runs. Is there is it true that there's bank runs are going on? And then the other question is Russian citizens protesting against the war. Will this have any effect on Putin? Do citizens in general support, or are they against the invasion? What's your sense of what's going on the ground?
Well, yeah, obviously there's a problem with that with regards to bank runs. Yeah, absolutely, there's a concern here. The Russians are trying to raise the bank interest rate, right, to up to 20%, right, to be able to help the ruble withstand collapse. Even in the days leading up to the removal from SWIFT, there already was a crash of the ruble. It moved from having a 4-week rally in the late January, early February period to falling to the lowest level since 2016. And now the rate has increased in terms of interest from 9.5 to 20%. So after the ruble collapsed by 30%. So these numbers on the interest rate front and on the currency collapse front are staggering at this moment. So I think absolutely we could expect to see larger bank runs. There's been massive reports of crowds in Moscow of people emergency withdrawing cash. The phrase depreciation, devaluation. There's a lot of there were people who were being interviewed were concerned about those issues, and they were concerned even to the point that inflation in Russia would rise to such a high level that they would actually be unable to afford food for their families. They'd be able to afford basic consumer goods. So it's a kind of financial panic that I don't think we've seen in Russia since the financial crises in the 1990s. I'm not even saying the 1998 ruble crisis. I'm saying the crises of the early transition period after Gorbachev fell with hyperinflation. So like the 1992, 1993 constitutional crisis, that time frame when there were a lot of shortages and upsurges in extreme poverty. So we're looking at something quite serious from that front. Okay. And also, there's a lot of concern too with regards to just the deprivation of electronics, technology, consumer goods like this that the U.S. imposed sanctions, which, if paired with the Taiwanese semiconductor sanctions, are going to make it much harder for people to have access to electronic goods. That's another thing that I'm seeing people in Russia being especially concerned about from the consumer side.
Yeah. And then in terms of, Russian citizens, the protests we've seen on TV against the invasion and more generally, what's, do we have a sense of what Russians' positions are?
So it's important to keep in mind that in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, there was a massive rally around the flag effect surrounding Vladimir Putin, right? The approval rating of Vladimir Putin increased from 59% to around 91%. And that level of approval rating above 80% persisted for more than 2 years after the invasion began, not necessarily just because of Ukraine, because of the general mood of anti-Westernism in the country and the successes militarily, at least initially in Syria. So there were other factors at play, but the Crimea annexation was the proximate cause of that increase in approval rating, and the other factors were what caused it to be maintained. However, in the context of the current operation, there's much lower levels of popularity for it. And that's abundantly clear from looking at sociological research surveys prior to the invasion. For example, 62% of Russians believe that Russia and Ukraine are the same people. So they're both one country. Only 36% of Russians would support the annexation of Ukraine by force. So a military solution to bring that reunification about. Only half of Russians would support a military intervention to basically see Russia annex Ukraine over NATO, right? Membership. So the NATO threat is not really widely believed, and the threat of this kind of reunification by force is also not widely supported. And given the level of censorship and given the level of push polling and pressure and selection bias in opinion surveys, which could cause people to kind of downplay their true levels of opposition to what the Kremlin is doing, the actual numbers in support of this are likely a lot lower. A plurality of Russians view the European Union and the United States positively now. It was only 12% of Russians saw the U.S. positively in 2014. Now 45% view. And this is all from the independent Levada Center survey. So this is not state-run surveys. The other first few data that were done by a CNN American polling agency. So these are outside independent sources that are verifying this. And the majority of people in Russia, just with regards to sanctions, 2/3 of them do not believe the sanctions are impacting their day-to-day life prior to this invasion. And there was an even split between those who believe that sanctions were punishing the elites versus the people. The kind of sanctions that we're seeing now, the kind of currency depreciation that we're seeing now, the expulsion from SWIFT, the loss of electronic goods, the potential for even concerns about food shortages in Russia, which have been surfacing, means that the sanctions are going to be taken much more personally this time around. So there's low levels of support for revanchism by force, a lot more concern about sanctions this time around. There's not really much support for these military objectives. And the kind of intervention that's popular in Russia is a police mission, like we saw in Kazakhstan. Short, successful, to the point. This kind of long, high-cost war is not very desirable. So that's why I don't think that there'll be much public support for Putin. Putin is pandering to a much smaller base domestically, around 1/3 of the population, rather than trying to pander to the vast majority in terms of the actual policy that he's conducting. And we're seeing that in other signs too. The no to war hashtag was the top Twitter hashtag in the day following the invasion coming from Russia. So on social media, netizens are speaking out, even outside of traditional havens like VK and Telegram, but actual other social media websites. And the crackdowns on Google, on Facebook, on Twitter from Russia is probably to suppress information about casualties and also suppress this kind of mobilization and dissent. We've seen the Russian opposition take a much more firm stand against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Alexei Navalny, who was okay with the Crimea annexation, is now saying that this is a diversionary war to take away from Russia's mismanagement of its economy and from corruption internally. That's a very big step that could lead to him organizing and mobilizing protests. We've seen Russian academics like Sergei Utkin from IMIMORAN, probably most strikingly, Artyom Lukin, who's a major sinologist in Vladivostok, condemning the invasion publicly in the starkest possible terms. We've seen Oleg Deripaska even talk about peace, right? He's one of Putin's closest oligarch buddies. And the Russian climate change envoy in the United Nations condemning the war and then saying it's not as the government's opinion. We're seeing a lot more public displays of dissent now from academics, from politicians, and even off the record from diplomats than we ever saw during the Crimea annexation of 2014. Those people supported it or kept silent, and now they're taking a stand. I think that that's a sign that Vladimir Putin's popularity at home is going to probably go down rather than up after this, with long-term repercussions for the stability of the Russian regime.
Okay, understood. Yeah, just a couple more questions. I mean, we're running out of time, but what's your view on the oligarchs and turning the screws of the oligarchs? I mean, will that make an impact? I mean, there's some oligarchs coming out against the Putin, but what's your sort of view on the dynamic with the oligarchs?
So that's an interesting thing. I mean, obviously, the oligarchs during the early 2000s, right, went from being these kind of rogue actors, which kind of could actually influence policy in a very profound way, actually shape the direction of policy. Like Boris Berezovsky sitting under Boris Yeltsin's thumb, actually being the true puppet master in terms of economic policy, in terms of most aspects of domestic politics, if not foreign policy and security policy, but certainly domestic and economic policy. The oligarchs were either repressed by Vladimir Putin, like Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky, who went too far, or they entered a social compact with them, like Abramovich and people like that. So they they became friends with them and they embraced him and they did this type of thing. So the oligarchs now are having to rethink their role within the Russian state and their relationship with the Russian state. And that's quite significant. You're seeing oligarchs doing several things. Number one, some oligarchs are emerging as actual influencers of policy, trying in a subtle way to steer Vladimir Putin in a more moderate direction. That's what we saw with the Terabashka statement that I just mentioned. And we're also even seeing Roman Abramovich do that too by accepting a Ukrainian request to hold talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The British MPs are saying that all his assets should be kind of frozen and stripped if he doesn't condemn the war outright. He's not condemning the war outright, but he's offering diplomacy, which is about as far as he can go without completely burning the bridge that he's built for 20 years with Vladimir Putin. So oligarchs are now subtly acting as a force of moderation on Russian policy going forward. And that is something that's quite interesting to watch. The owner of the Evening Standard, for example, Yevgeny Lebedev, is calling outright for an end to the invasion of Ukraine. So some of the other ones, expatriates, are going further. But that's what we should kind of see, is these oligarchs kind of causing Putin to cool things off.
Okay. And I mean, this question I've been thinking a lot about from a kind of a markets perspective, is would Russia decide to cut off oil and gas exports in response to Western sanctions to induce some kind of energy shock? This is from Hongmar.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, when the SWIFT removal was first discussed, there was a lot of concern inside Russia that, and at least the Russians use this as a kind of not necessarily threat to the West, but kind of like a signal to the West that if you cut Russia out of SWIFT, Russian gas is not going to be able to enter European territory. And there were disruptions before the war in Yamal, the pipeline between Germany and Poland. And those disruptions looked like they were logistical, they were supply, but the timing of it with that statement was very interesting for a lot of people to suggest that Russia was already showing that it could use gas as a weapon in a significant way. 40% of European gas comes from Russia. Some countries is significantly higher than that. Interestingly, there's no real correlation between, if you look at the list of percentage of countries in their dependence on Russian gas and their support for sanctions. That correlation is not really that there, but it's still an important factor in terms of how they approach their relationship with Russia. I think that right now the Russians were relieved that at least in the initial stages, the British did not suspend or impose punitive measures on Gazprom and Rosneft. They kind of left those out from the initial sanctions package, but they're watching quite closely the British Petroleum Rosneft saga that we're seeing now happen, where they're basically having to surrender those assets, right? Of $25 million. Is that going to be a one-off thing, or are more British and more European companies going to be following in that route? The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has also cut $2.83 billion out of Russia in its investments, much of which are clustered in 50 different companies, but also in the energy sector. So if things stay as they are, and there's just like these kind of piecemeal crackdowns on Russian energy here or there, and there isn't a massive full-scale divestment from Russian gas, which is possible because the alternative suppliers, Qatar, Azerbaijan, Algeria, Turkmenistan, they just don't have the bandwidth to supply it. Japan has not really taken action on moving LNG to Europe like the Americans had requested. So it's possible that the Russians are not going to really use gas as a weapon in that scenario, but in a scenario in which there is a much faster divestment than we might expect from Russian gas, and new deals are signed with alternative suppliers that might have more potential than we initially planned for, and there's more crackdowns on investments like the BP issue or the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund's conduct, then I can definitely see Russia using gas in a much more weaponized fashion to try to catch the Europeans off guard.
Okay, and now I'm going to just round off this webinar with two of my questions. I'll present it more as scenarios. What do you think is a potential path for the best outcome, in the next few weeks and months, and what's the path for the worst outcome?
So the path for the best outcome would be obviously a situation where there's a attritional war happening inside Ukraine, that the major population centers just don't fall towards Russia, and Russia is forced in a position to declare some kind of victory. So taking over some territory in Donbass, getting a security concession out of the West, and then leaving, saying that its objectives are reasonably sustained. So that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is obviously this invasion continues. Either it lasts a long time and Russia continues to fight the war regardless, or Kiev falls faster than we might think, and we see Medvedchuk, one of his cronies, taking over in charge and destroying Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. It's important to keep in mind that Medvedchuk's only got around 29 Rada members behind him. The support and popularity of a pro-Russian government in Ukraine is probably going to be about as low as what it was Yanukovych's approval ratings when he was overthrown in Euromaidan. So we're looking at under 20% support for that. So there's not going to be much support for that kind of puppet regime. It's going to be heavily dependent on Russia as a security provider. It's going to be a little bit like Bahrain, needing the Saudis to come in when there's protests, or Tokayev in Kazakhstan, needing the Russians to come in. It's going to have that kind of dependency on it because the government is just not popular. And that's the worst case scenario that we're going to see, that kind of regime installed, and Russia basically turning Ukraine into another Belarus or Kazakhstan and subordinating its sovereignty to a level that we have not seen since 1991.
Okay, no, that's great. Okay, I think we can kind of round it off there. So if people wanted to follow you, the best way is on Twitter. We included it in the email circular for this webinar. You also mentioned two people to follow on the military side. What were their names again?
Oh, Michael Kaufman.
Michael Kaufman, okay.
Kaufman, and Rob Lee.
And Rob Lee. And both of them on Twitter, are they? Or
they're on Twitter, yeah, and they're very vocal on Twitter. yeah, we all are basically just firing off about this crisis all the time.
Okay, great, good stuff. And then obviously on the market side, people can come to the Macro Hive site where they can get kind of market views. So with that, Sam, excellent as always. Thanks for answering all these questions. Bombarding you questions left, right, and center. And yeah, let's just hope things ease up in the coming days.
Yeah, let's hope. Everybody hopes that. Yeah, it's just a scary situation right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending the webinar, and yeah, good luck with everything. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.